And our final speaker on this panel, it's my pleasure to introduce Vishal Maria, Director of Fraud and Financial Crime Practice for EMEA and Asia Pacific at SAS. Vishal.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you. Well, firstly, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Vishal Maria, and I head up Fraud and Financial Crimes for SAS across EMEA AP. Before I go through the presentation, just want to say a thank you for the organisation of today's event, both to Emirates ID and to the UN. It's my third visit to Abu Dhabi. I come in my last trip. We were actively working on a project around fraud and risk for a large provider here in healthcare. It's fascinating how the UAE and the Gulf have looked into financial crimes over the last 5 years. One of my early visits into the Gulf back in 2007, I witnessed the maturity happening within the organisations here, and it's very nice to see how it's growing. What I'm going to talk about today is a case study that my colleagues have been working with in a department in the US. But fundamentally, there was a survey that was taken place back in 2000 and recently back in 2013, where an organisation monitored how many breaches were there around the cyber threat. The survey showed over 300 million attempts last year at breaking firewalls or other intrusion detection devices within the organisation. In my personal view, I think that's a lower estimate. I think certain surveys were done purposefully and the questions were raised purposefully. That 300 million, in my view, is quite low, and I think the actual numbers were a lot higher. However, as we all know, the threat from cyber is growing. If it's what we mentioned on LinkedIn earlier, or the recent one on the SSL, these threats are more and more today and more of a threat for our organisations globally. And as one of the gentlemen mentioned, even if it could be something like a LinkedIn website, how that can affect other organisations or other areas where those passwords or usernames could be similar, again, is a major threat to society and a major threat to our organisations. So as we open up data and as we start analysing this data in one area, these threats are going to increase. I always call it a cat and mouse game between us, security people, with fraudsters or cyber criminals. And it's always about catching today's problem and analysing tomorrow's. We need to look at what the data provides us and how we can analyse that both from a policy perspective but also from our analytics perspective. So I'll go through a real case study, and again, I think there's a lot to be taken from this case study on how we, better put our policies together around detecting cyber criminals, but also how do we look at tomorrow's threat and ensure that we are putting the best defenses on our data security and our analytics to prevent and detect the next threat. So this organisation that we worked with, again, I will have to leave the name encrypted, let's say, for the own organisation that we're working with. The challenge that this agency had was that it had a lot of defenses, it had a lot of systems, it had a lot of technology, it had a lot of policy in place. But it fundamentally became a needle in a haystack problem. There were a number of alerts that systems and policies were generating. And the challenge faced by this organisation is that the more they looked, the more they found. And the more they found either was fruitful or in many cases caused them false positives, what we term. So these were alerts generated by systems that when they went to investigate were actually normal alerts. And alerts rightly generated, but there was a normal reason or a right reason for that activity to happen. So what this causes in an environment, it becomes less of an investigation, more an operational task. And when we are talking about operational tasks and allowing humans to analyze those operational tasks, it is probe to actual deficiencies within the process. And so what that fundamentally can cause is that the users become disenfranchised with investigations and allow some events to get through, but also from a time and a cost perspective to allow certain events to not be properly analyzed, and it becomes more of an operational task. And as I mentioned earlier, the volume of data here is fundamental. Before we were talking, 10 years ago, it was around gigabytes, petabytes. There are fundamental volume of data here to be analyzed. And wouldn't it be beautiful if all that data was coming from one data source, or it was all in structure, a name, address, telephone number, etc. That would be an ideal world. Unfortunately, we don't live in an ideal world. And a lot of the data and a lot of the value of some of this data actually is in unstructured data, blogs, text. This is huge value. But the challenge with this is the sheer volume of this data, the number of data sources to digest, the number of data points they're coming from. If I look at in the private sector, banks, insurance companies have an amount of data that they can analyze. In the government sector, in the public sector, again, we have internal data, but we also have access to fundamental open data. And again, it's huge volume. And then from that data, we have to analyze it, we have to run our own analytics, et cetera, and again, can cause us challenges if that data is not consistent, if it's not cleansed, if it's not good in accuracy, et cetera, et cetera. One of the gentlemen earlier spoke about if the data is compromised and how does that affect organizations. Now, yes, that data being compromised, we can fix that data. But the challenge becomes is what other systems are linking back to that data source? And how many places do we need to make that change? So the organization that we were working with gave us some exam questions, as I call it. Prove your worth, I think one of the sponsors was saying. Tell me what you can do and how you can help us in 3 core areas. One was all around real-time assessment, sub-second response. I don't want to know that we had a problem 6 months ago. I want to know I've got a problem today. Ideally, I want to know I've got a problem right now. So the timing was key. The second thing, which again was probably high on his priority, was that I don't want you to create me more alerts. I have alerts. I have thousands of alerts. I have more alerts than what I know I could do with. What I want you to be able to do is consolidate and suppress some of these alerts, but don't lose any of the actual real tangible alerts. So is that compromise of reducing but not losing the needle in that haystack, not losing the value there. A third point, which again is absolutely key, is to find the holistic view of that risk. So if somebody's penetrating a system and that person is also penetrating another system, if we can, it will be great to understand that holistic view, that this one entity is penetrating multiple systems. Instead of having what I call a squash balloon effect, I squeeze them here and it comes out over here. And then I squeeze them here again and it comes out somewhere else. The key thing is to look at my holistic view, the holistic view of risk management. And that was one of the third points, is that one of these alerts could be investigated by an operator. Another alert could be investigated by an additional operator. I want to be able to look at that holistic view. And then taking that from a next degree is to say, okay, I'm not looking at just that one alert in isolation. I want to look at the patterns of those alerts. So are there any commonalities between alert A with alert B? Did they come through the same access rights? Did they look at the same IP address and session cookie data? Did it come through the same time zones? Did it come with the same username and password information? That, again, is value information. And being able to provide that holistic risk and that holistic view was also a key exam question here. And the other challenge is a scalability. Today, I have access to 300 data sources, for example. Tomorrow, I will have access to 400 data sources. I don't want to stop just today. One of the colleagues earlier, one of the presenters earlier, talked about data-driven policy. I talk about data-driven investigation. To allow the data to drive my intelligence. Where should my intelligence be today? The power is in the data. More data, the better. The client that we were working with here came from the same school of thought. The more places I can touch a person in the data, the more accurate I will be able to risk assess that person. The more information I can have with that person, with that piece of data, the more accurate I can risk assess that person. I can risk assess that threat to my organization, and I can risk assess the threat to my personal information that I have within that data. So what did we do? So with this particular challenge, the client gave us 10 weeks. 10 weeks of getting, well, they had the access to the data, of getting that data into an accurate format, to plug that data into an analytic environment, to provide the holistic view of each entity in that data. An entity, just to be clear here, is anything physical in the information. So people, addresses, telephone numbers, anything physical, IP addresses and session cookies being another good example of an entity. Creating those entities within that data in a formable format, in a scalable format. Aggregating alerts which were generated by existing systems to those entities. And then finding those hidden relationships between those entities. And then applying a risk framework around those networks, those entities. Now, this is a massive data problem. In the UK, I did a presentation a few months ago in front of the Cabinet Office. And the CABA were talking about data lakes. It's the new phrase around from big data. It's now called data lakes. How can we use this data lake to better predict, better prevent risk to our organization? And that data lake is not just internal data. That data lake comprises with high volume of open source information. And how do we best use that in our arsenal to ensure we better prevent? Detection is great. You need detection, but I want to prevent at the front door of challenges within my organization. Once we've had that data and we've been able to analyze it, one thing is absolutely critical for our client here was to be able to explore that data in a structured format. So if I know Vishal Maria is of suspect or Vishal Maria's access has been compromised, I want to be able to do the root cause analysis of that in seconds. I want to be able to dive deeper into that information in a very structured and auditable fashion to ensure I find out more things around this compromise. Those things could be what other systems have been compromised, what other data files could be of risk. How many people has this challenge touched in our data? And then once we can understand that, then we can put better recourse. As I mentioned earlier, it's a cat and mouse game. And the question is, are we the cat or are we the mouse? I've always wanted to be the cat. We've got to stay a step ahead of the challenges. The other challenge and the other part of the process was how do we better optimize existing systems? So there are multiple systems detecting this type of threat into the organization. How do we better optimize those local systems? So one of the key principles is that this cannot be a closed environment, a closed box. It must be an open box. So therefore, if I'm generating any new strategies, or if I'm generating new analytic theorems or better business rules, I want to be able to take that from this level and put it back into those source systems to ensure better prediction going forward. So being able to extract the information was also key. What were some of the results? The nice point during this whole theorem and this whole project we did was we were able to prevent these attacks quicker than current systems that they had deployed. And this wasn't rocket science. This was joining up the dots within the organization. It was joining up System A alerts with System B alerts with System C alerts, and actually saying, that point there, you've got a major issue on. If we look at police investigations today, when an investigation is happening, the intelligence the police use is not just from one source, it's from multiple sources. When they're about to break down a door to go and make an arrest, they will work out what is the exit path for the claimant. Where could he come out if I go through the front door? It could be the back door. It could be the side door. Make sure we have our protection around that. How do we know what time he's going to be there? We have the intelligence around that. Now, all of that information is coming from multiple sources. Again, if we are going to tackle this type of problem, we need to be looking at those multiple sources to get a better richness of when we come to prevent. The second point, which was absolutely key for this client, was finding that holistic view of the entity, but also the relationships. So if I touch this or stop this problem here, it's not going to suddenly cause me more problems here. It's to reduce the impact of that squash balloon effect. If I squeeze it here, it's not going to cause me a bubble here. Data's king. Data will become larger. Open source information is getting richer. Having a scalable infrastructure is going to be key. And that was another key point here. And being able to prioritize our investigation, knowing which set of systems or which set of alerts to investigate first, is fundamental in the way we operate and operationalize strategies and platforms. So just as a summary point, we live in an age where data is growing. We live in an age where data is going to grow even further. I'm completely for of more open data. At the presentation I've done at the European Parliament office 3 months ago, I explained the value of having that open source information in better prevention and detection, and I absolutely agree and stand by that principle. Was that telling me to finish? I'll just finish off my last point here. I'm assuming that's a test, otherwise the door should be absolutely open and we should be running. Data will increase. Systems will be generating alerts. But what's absolutely fundamental, we need to have a holistic view of our risk and aggregate that information at a holistic view. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for your time. I had the last slot. I hope I kept you entertained, and have a good evening and safe travels back home. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Vishal. Well, I'm not sure whether anyone wants to ask a quick question at this stage, or whether everyone feels they've had it for the day. Shall we call it a day? There's some nods to that proposition. Okay, thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, to this we conclude our session today. We hope you all had a great time. Thank you all for attending. Please be present tomorrow at 8:45 as the sessions will begin at 9 a.m. sharp. Thank you again. Have a good evening.
Thank you.